When we talk about peace, most people think of it as the absence of war, the silence after gunfire, the stillness of a battlefield once it has been cleared. But that's a shallow definition. Peace is not just the lack of violence, it is the condition that allows human beings to flourish in the deepest sense. Without peace, you cannot build, you cannot create, you cannot even think properly. A person living under constant fear, whether that fear comes from bombs overhead or conflict within their own home, is not free to live a meaningful life. They are trapped in survival mode, and survival mode strips life of its richness. Think for a moment about what it takes for you to focus on something meaningful, whether that's studying, raising a family, building a career, or simply enjoying a conversation with a friend. You need a baseline of stability, an assurance that you won't be interrupted by chaos or danger. The same principle applies to nations and to humanity as a whole. Without peace, there can be no justice. Without peace, there can be no prosperity. And without peace, there can be no love, no knowledge, and no progress. When societies are at war, all their resources are consumed by destruction. The brightest minds are forced to design weapons instead of solving problems. Economies collapse under the weight of conflict. Families are torn apart, children grow up in trauma, and entire generations lose the opportunity to rise beyond the basic struggle of survival. War is parasitic. It drains the energy of humanity and leaves behind emptiness. Peace, on the other hand, is generative. It is the soil in which art, science, and culture take root. Every great achievement of humanity, our literature, our architecture, our philosophies, or discoveries, has been born out of periods of relative peace. There's also a psychological dimension to this. You cannot have a peaceful world without peaceful minds. When individuals are restless, filled with hatred, envy, or resentment, they project that turmoil outward. Small conflicts multiply, distrust spreads, and before long, those inner battles manifest as external wars. But when individuals cultivate inner peace, when they learn to control their emotions, to resolve their disputes with honesty and fairness, to manage their resentments rather than feeding them, that inner order scales outward into families, communities, and eventually nations. So peace is not merely a political or military achievement. It is fundamentally psychological, even spiritual. And here's something crucial. Peace is not weakness. People often confuse peace with passivity, as if to say that to seek peace is to avoid responsibility, to avoid confrontation, or to ignore injustice. That's not peace that the Sincender Sem Sinu. That's not peace. That's cowardice dressed up in virtue. True peace requires immense strength. It requires the discipline to master your impulses, the courage to forgive, the wisdom to see beyond short-term revenge, and the patience to build something lasting instead of destroying it in a moment of rage. Peace is an achievement of the strong, not the weak. Only those with power over themselves, power over their instincts, can create peace that endures. Now think about the fragility of peace. It is like a delicate fabric woven together by countless acts of restraint, cooperation, and understanding. Tear it, and the unraveling can be swift and devastating. That's why peace must be protected, not just at the level of treaties and laws, but at the level of daily life. Every time you choose to listen rather than interrupt, every time you choose to resolve an argument with fairness rather than force, you're contributing to the preservation of that fabric. You might think your small decisions don't matter, but they do, because the pattern of peace is stitched together one choice at a time. If peace is the foundation of everything good, then the absence of peace is the breeding ground for everything destructive. Look at the state of the world whenever conflict erupts. People displaced from their homes, economies collapsing, generations of trauma carried forward. It is not just the visible destruction. The collapsed buildings, the burned fields, it's the invisible destruction that's even worse. It's the mistrust between neighbors, the bitterness that lasts decades, the suspicion that poisons every future attempt at cooperation. This is why peace is not just desirable, it is necessary. What we must realize is that peace is the prerequisite for civilization itself. It is not a luxury that comes after prosperity. It is the very condition that makes prosperity possible. It is not an afterthought to justice. It is the state that allows justice to even function. Everything rests upon it. If you destroy peace, you destroy the platform upon which all other human endeavors stand. So, when we say that peace is the most important thing in the world, it is not an exaggeration. It is a recognition of reality. Peace is the foundation. It is the ground beneath our feet. It is the air in our lungs. Without it, nothing else can be sustained. The great challenge then is to treat peace not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily practice, a moral duty, and the highest form of strength, because in the end, peace is not just the absence of conflict, it is the presence of possibility. And if we lose it, we lose everything. If peace is the foundation upon which all human flourishing rests, then the natural question becomes, who is responsible for building and protecting that foundation? Too often, we assume that peace is the business of politicians, generals, or international organizations. We point outward and say it's their job, but that mindset is dangerous because it absolves us of responsibility and ignores the truth. Peace always begins at the level of the individual. If people cannot govern themselves, if they cannot cultivate peace in their own lives, then no law, no treaty, no government will be able to impose peace from the outside. A society is simply the sum of its individuals. If those individuals are resentful, vengeful, impulsive, and chaotic, then the society will reflect that. If individuals cultivate patience, understanding, and strength, then the society will reflect that as well. You think of it like a mirror. The wars we see at the national or global level are often reflections of unresolved conflict at smaller scales. When families are dysfunctional, when communities are hostile, when individuals carry bitterness and hatred in their hearts, those small fires combine into large-scale infernos. In contrast, when individuals take responsibility for mastering their emotions, for treating others with fairness, for resolving disputes with courage and honesty, those acts of peace ripple outward. They influence families, shape communities, and eventually create the conditions which nations can coexist without destruction. Peace is not simply handed down from the top, it is built from the bottom up. But this requires a radical shift in mindset because it means recognizing that every one of us has a role to play. The way you speak to your child when you're angry matters. The way you treat a colleague when you feel misunderstood matters. The way you respond to betrayal, injustice, or insult matters. Each of those moments is a crossroads. If you choose resentment and retaliation, you plant seeds of conflict. If you choose patience, truth, and forgiveness, you plant seeds of peace. Those seeds grow whether you want them to or not. So the real question is, what are you planting? Now it's important to understand that peace is not the same as avoidance. Some people mistake peace for simply refusing to confront issues, for letting problems fester in silence, for saying it's fine when it is not fine. But that's not peace, that's suppression. Suppression always backfires because buried resentment eventually erupts, and when it does, it's usually more destructive than if the conflict had been faced honestly from the start. Real peace comes through truth. It means having the courage to face conflict directly, to articulate what is wrong, to negotiate with others in good faith, and to seek resolution rather than domination. That kind of peace is not easy. It demands emotional maturity, self-control, and integrity. but without it there can be no stability. There is also the temptation to think that peace requires perfection, that only when the world is free of injustice or inequality can we have peace. But that's an illusion. The world will never be perfect. Human beings are flawed, limited, and prone to error. Waiting for perfection before choosing peace is like refusing to plant seeds until the weather is guaranteed. If you take that approach, you will never plant anything, and famine will follow. The truth is, peace must be chosen even in the presence of imperfection. In fact, it is precisely because the world is unjust and imperfect that peace is so necessary. It is the only thing that allows us to work on those imperfections without destroying ourselves in the process. And here's where the individual responsibility becomes urgent. If you cannot bring peace into your own home, if you cannot regulate your own emotions, if you cannot act with integrity in your daily interactions, how do you expect the world to change? It is hypocritical to demand peace at the global level while sowing chaos in your personal life. Every act of unnecessary anger, every dishonest word, every refusal to reconcile is a small betrayal of the very peace we claim to want. This is why the great teachers of humanity, religious leaders, philosophers, moral thinkers, always began with the individual. Change yourself, master yourself, bring order to your own soul. Then, and only then, will you have the strength to contribute to peace on a larger scale. The responsibility is heavy, but it is also empowering. It means you are not powerless. You do not have to wait for governments or treaties to shape the future. You can shape it yourself in the way you live, in the way you raise your children, in the way you treat your neighbors. Small acts of peace accumulate just as small acts of violence accumulate. The question is not whether you will influence the world. You already do. The question is how? So if peace is indeed the most important thing in the world, then it must be understood not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily practice. Personal commitment. You cannot demand peace from others while refusing to create it yourself. You cannot complain about wars abroad while waging wars in your home, in your relationships, or within your own mind. The task is clear. If we want a peaceful world, we must become peaceful people. Because in the end, global peace is nothing more than individual peace multiplied by millions. And the choice to begin rests with each of us right here, right now.